Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Miguel, and happy to be here today. I'm a solutions architect at AWS. I've been working at AWS for 3 years. I come from an infrastructure automation background, we could say. I previously worked at Nordcloud, which is a consulting company you might know that was, in the meantime, bought by IBM. I live in Helsinki. I've been living there almost half of my life, sorry. And today, so continuing on the security topic, I'm going to talk about how you can operate a secure cloud environment on AWS. There will be a lot of service names, but the ideas behind are the same that we have been discussing. So it's IT, common challenges that we try to address with AWS services. Before we start, this is something you might know already, but it's about what we call at AWS the shared responsibility model. So when you deploy things on AWS, part of the responsibility to keep things running is on us. So the infrastructure, the access control to our data centers, the hypervisor layer, the host operating systems, and so on. So that is on us. But then when you deploy your applications, of course, you might want to release things to public, you might want to configure things in a certain way, and that is up to you then to configure applications properly, protect your data and your workloads. So, and this is what we're going to talk about today. So the top part is how you can do that, the security in the cloud. So let's start with the most basic unit for those maybe less familiar with AWS, which is the AWS account. It's kind of like a resource container for your cloud resources. It's an explicit security boundary, so when you assume an identity, you are operating in one account. And it's also a container for cost tracking, so all your costs can be easily tracked against accounts. And also as a blast radius, so to reduce your blast radius, so if something gets misconfigured, or if you hit a certain limit, because accounts come with limits that sometimes can be raised, but for example, number of very large instances that you run, or how many API calls you make in a quick succession. So all those things are contained in one account. So if you are working on another account, it won't affect that. Over time, customers will start separating their workloads into different accounts because of these advantages. What is an identity? So it's a uniquely recognizable entity that does actions inside your AWS account. It can be a federated user, so somebody which has authenticated with an external identity provider gets temporary credentials to do things on an AWS account. But it can also be roles that you assume, or that instances, compute workloads assume themselves to perform things. So they need access to your resources, you need to give them roles, otherwise they don't have access to things like objects in S3 buckets. You can also provide AWS services access, so you can create a policy and tell that this policy trusts a certain AWS service. Think about AWS backup. To back up your S3 data, you need explicitly to give permission to that service to access your S3 bucket, otherwise they will not be able by default to kind of do the backups. Everything you do in AWS accounts generates an event, and this is the CloudTrail, AWS CloudTrail service. These events tell what happened, on which time, by who, what was the result of the action, and so on. Everything that you do. So these events can actually be filtered, and with Event Bridge, you can route them to specific targets. So if you want to do things like remediation, somebody changes the security settings of your virtual private cloud or of your S3 bucket, you can trigger a Lambda that will put the configuration back, for example. But you can just also send it to an external API, generate an alert, or push to a queue to be processed later. Now, we talked about the multiple accounts. We need to have a way to manage all the different AWS accounts that you will have. And we do that with AWS organizations. So when you create a new account that is your billing account, it has the billing information, the credit card. That is your root account, and that is meant only for billing-related actions. You should then split out everything from there. And into this type of tree-like structure that you see here, so you create kind of folders or like organization units, the OUs, which contain accounts, and you can go as deep as you want. You can then apply service control policies on these OUs or on specific accounts, which are a way to restrict what can be done in those accounts. So if, for example, you have an account that keeps your logs, like a central logging account, you don't want S3 buckets to be deleted because you would be deleting evidence. So you can just remove the possibility. No user, even an administrator, cannot do that because the SCP overrides whatever permissions that user has. Right. So that's why you separate, so that you can apply specific policies to specific groups of accounts. Now, yeah, that's all good, but you need to have an opinionated way to create your landing zone. And by landing zone, what I mean is that it's this configuration, a well-configured AWS cloud environment where you can safely bring your workloads, bring your data, and you know that by default it is secure. And Control Tower is our service that helps you establish. So even if you're not starting with AWS, you already have AWS accounts, Control Tower now also allows you to bring your accounts into this Control Tower managed approach. It will create these 4 different groups for your account. So one will be the security group that contains, for example, your central logging, but also could contain security tooling that security engineers can use to, for example, collect evidence or analyze incidents. You could then have a shared services or infrastructure organization unit with multiple accounts. One account could be the networking, which provides access to other accounts for on-prem data center or for your office network. You could also have CI/CD tooling installed in the shared services account. And then you have the actual stuff that you're building, the workloads, which could further be subdivided into kind of tests and production, because it would make sense to have different policies applied. In production, maybe you would not want to allow people to log in, for example. Only tools could deploy, and maybe a break-glass procedure could also be used to access, but otherwise, no user access. And finally, a sandbox OU. This is before you go into any of these, let's say, more production accounts. Sandbox is just for trying out stuff. You could have some cost control, like limit how many instances people can launch there and so on. But let them experiment. Have maybe personal developer account. Sorry, I got the hair in my. All right. So, but okay, now we have this structure, and we want to apply so-called Control Tower helps you also apply to all your accounts guardrails, and guardrails are controls that either prevent you from doing certain things, and these are the SCPs that we just talked about. So there are policies that are enforced that you cannot, for example, launch an instance in a region that you are not operating in. But it can also be detective guardrails. Think about a thing like the CIS benchmark, which was already mentioned in our keynote talk. You might want to know how well you are doing against the benchmark, but not necessarily limit what people can do, because in some cases, maybe you need unencrypted S3 objects. So in that case, you can use config rules, again, deployed from Control Tower. These rules are constantly monitored, and you get a single pane of glass that will tell you how compliant are you to the rules that you yourself set across all your accounts. So a very simple way to manage multiple AWS accounts. Again, single sign-on. So you have the identities, and now you have multiple accounts you want to log into. AWS IAM Identity Center is the new name for what was called AWS SSO. So you can integrate it with an external identity provider to handle the authentication, or you can use the Identity Center's own directory, so you can create users and groups there. And how it will work is that it will go through the authentication flow, exchange some tokens, Identity Center has the user authenticated, and then there is a set of permissions and accounts that that user can access. Identity Center also integrates out of the box with other cloud applications, like commonly used, like Slack, Office 365. So you can use it as a single sign-on also for your other cloud apps. any cloud, any application that supports the SAML 2.0 federated, protocol will be able to integrate with SSO. So keep your identities in one store is the main idea here. Okay, we talked about setting the guardrails so your account is kind of safe from from errors that could lead to a huge cost, for example. But you might also need to baseline, create certain things so Control Tower as an account factory, you can create new accounts easily. You might want to baseline some things. For example, the virtual private cloud, your software-defined network in the cloud, can be created when you start a new account. Also, certain roles might need to be there, certain cross-account permissions, the configuration to send all of your logs into the centralized logging account. So a lot of things may be created from scratch. And of course, you can also bring your own customized templates for things that you need to have in those new accounts. Again, this is a Control Tower capability. And related to that, of course, the topic that we have heard already many times, infrastructure as code. We have CloudFormation is our service for infrastructure as code, but many people also use Terraform. And it works that you define in a declarative way the resources you want to have, the configuration, and then you can apply that across accounts in a controlled fashion. And this has implications for security as well, as I will explain next. So bringing a bit the developers and ops people together, AWS has released the development kit, Cloud Development Kit, or CDK, which is the same infrastructure as code approach, but using tools that are familiar to developers. So they can actually code infrastructure the same way as they code their apps, using familiar languages. You can reuse constructs, which are basically classes of configurations like best practices for deploying a bucket, or your own company's kind of best practices. So you can import these constructs from private construct repositories. And for security, the important thing is with the CDK tooling, so CDK, you create the CDK application, you synthesize the actual stack that is then applied. Actually, it supports both Terraform and CloudFormation. And then you deploy that stack. When you build with CDK, what you can do also is assertions for things that should never happen, like an S3 bucket being unencrypted or traffic open on non-HTTPS, and fail the build. So basically, the template is not produced. The artifact of the build is the template that you deploy. Also, CDK gives you actually a review of the security changes before you deploy. If you deploy it from the CLI, it will tell you, you are changing these policies, you are creating these roles. Everything that is security or that has security implications will be shown to you before you kind of deploy the app. How it could look in a cross-account. So how would be a good way to deploy like a template with infrastructure? It could also have code. So you could have a code repository that contains both your application code, your infrastructure code. You build it. If the build succeeds, you have a template, and you then deploy it in a staged way. So you go first, you do a cross-account deploy to a test account that is somehow similar to production. You then have maybe an email or an alert to a test engineer, which will go there and test if everything is fine, do some acceptance testing, and then click on the pipeline to continue, and it will then be deployed to production. The same exact template. I wanted to mention here, because we're talking about CDK and it being coding, familiar to people who code. There is the AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio Code. It's a really great, for those who use Visual Studio Code, it's a great way to create, manage, and deploy your CDK apps. Also accelerate coding. I don't know if you've heard about Amazon Code Whisperer, kind of like the GitHub Copilot, but it's trained on a lot of AWS-specific source code, like CloudFormation templates, CDK code. So it might be useful. Right, and you can switch between accounts and regions very easily and see list the resources you have from the Visual Studio console. Okay, now we talked about having a stable, well-configured, secure environment with guardrails and baselining, but we still need to protect the workloads that we will deploy to the cloud, to the AWS accounts. So virtual private cloud is the software-defined network that you create, and it is where you control the networking, right? All the instances or services you launch that run on your virtual private cloud will have a network interface that allows them to communicate with that network. The ways to protect are, the usual ways are network access control lists, which you apply to subnets and which tell which IPs and what ports can be used in communicating between subnets, or security groups. They are both like firewalls, but a bit different. Security groups are stateful, knuckles are stateless. The security groups you attach directly to the network interface. So that's the difference. So if you want more security, you should use both. AWS Network Firewall, now it came up. It's kind of an appliance if you need more than just the base firewall. If you need packet inspection, attack prevention, for all your traffic, you can use the network firewall. It can do all these rules that are also on the higher layers, like domains that you cannot access, find signatures in packets that might be commonly used attack vectors and things like that. You can also manage all these rules, so your network firewall rules, your knuckle, your security groups, across all the accounts with Firewall Manager. So this allows you to kind of deploy the same configuration, the same network policies everywhere. One more service. I know there are a lot of them, but of course we're talking about the underlying things, right, that these services address. So Amazon Inspector is about scanning all the things you run either on EC2 or on containers, your container images, for example, and looking for vulnerabilities. So checking if you have outdated libraries, you're using some operating system which is not the latest, and giving you a report or actually creating findings for these vulnerabilities in your account. Also network exposure, so it's kind of doing a pen test to your environment, so it kind of tells you, okay, maybe there are some ports that you have that are accessible that you might not want to have accessible. And we talked about the VPC, right? This is your software-defined network. It's running in one region. It's across different availability zones, different locations, but these locations are very close together because the latency needs to be, very small. But the AWS backbone is, of course, much more than a region. We have actually 29 regions. We just launched Spain. Spain is the latest region. This week we launched it, I believe. Switzerland was the one previous to that. But we also have over 400 points of presence across the globe, which are all connected by private, high bandwidth, redundant, cables, fiber optic cables. So this is the network that customers can leverage. And you can actually push your application from your VPC, where the traffic might hit already in the region. You can push it out to CloudFront. And if you do that, when your users try to access your application, they'll go to the nearest edge location, which is much closer than probably the nearest region. So latency will improve. You can also use it for caching, so you don't need to. So the load on your origin, your kind of web application, will reduce. But it also has good properties for security, namely in the DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks, and I will explain why. But before that, we're going to talk so continuing on the application protection, so the workloads you deploy. You can actually, web application firewall will help you set rules to protect your public endpoints in either of these services. So they can be CloudFront, it can be directly on your VPC in an application load balancer, API gateway, AppSync, which is a GraphQL API. Cognito offers a hosted UI also for your users of your app to authenticate. all these endpoints are protected by WAF. And what WAF does is that it applies a set of rules that either are created by you or are managed by AWS or third-party vendors. And this can be either IP-based, it can apply lists of malicious IPs that drops the traffic as soon as possible so it doesn't hit your origin, your application server. Also rate-based rules, some login page, some heavy processing pages that require a lot of processing from backend. You might impose rate limits so that the same IP cannot keep hitting those points. And then you have rule-based, which look at payloads, headers, try to find commonly used attack signatures and block those. And then behavior-based, which are like looking for bots that are crawling your site, for example. You might not want them. Some bots are kind of useful, like search engines. Other bots you might not want to be crawling through your whole website, causing load. Also, account takeover is a new behavior-based control, which tries to prevent the damage that can happen when somebody takes over an account and tries to do damage through a third-party account. You can do many things, so you can respond. So when traffic matches this rule, and the idea is that you want to differentiate between what is normal and what is attacker traffic, right? So you cannot also start by blocking when you found a rule, because if you might be affecting normal traffic. So you might want to just count, just look at, observe how many times this rule is being triggered, and then check if normal traffic is not going to be affected, and then eventually block. If you detect a bot, you might also want to show a CAPTCHA, so a way to filter out, a kind of like a puzzle that the bot would need to solve, but only a human can solve it easily. And now about the distributed denial of service attacks, distributed. So, and why CloudFront is a great way to for the largest distributed denial of service. If you look at the whole, the AWS backbone, the earliest you can drop the traffic, the earliest you can detect the DDoS, the more protected you are. And the capacity the network needs to absorb. So we're talking about attacks that went from a few gigabits per second, which is already large, to nowadays it's common terabit per second attacks. The largest attacks are now multiple terabit per second, can be from government actors, hacktivists, whatever. When you use CloudFront, use the whole distributed cloud network, what you do is that you more quickly can shift traffic and early on, respond and absorb that huge traffic much better than if the traffic arrives at your instance or at your VPC, because that's already limited by the network interfaces that you have, the instance size, for example. Shield is a team at AWS that actually only is concerned with DDoS over the whole AWS infrastructure. A lot of them are automatically mitigated, but of course, all the time new attacks arise, and they need to address those attacks and find ways to mitigate and then automate that mitigation. But Shield offers also, Shield Advanced is a service that customers can subscribe to. So the Shield team is looking at the whole AWS traffic. But if you create certain health checks to your endpoints that need to be protected, if your company is a subject of these attacks, if you are a media company or a government service, providing government services, then it might make sense to take this service, because the same team that is specialized in the DDoS attacks will be alerted to things happening on your endpoints. So specific attacks that might be targeting you might not be visible in the whole grand scheme of things, but are affecting you. So they can start a call with you, and also they can manage a WAF rule that they will use to mitigate the traffic automatically, and then remove the WAF rule when the attack has subsided. Okay, one of the final topics or services we're going to talk is guard duty. So we describe the events that are generated when you do something on AWS, the CloudTrail events. There are many more things being logged, network flows, DNS queries, also S3. You can also enable S3 data plane events, so all objects that you read from S3 are recorded. If you use Kubernetes and you use the EKS, the managed Kubernetes service, also the control plane of Kubernetes, all the actions there are also logged Guard Duty takes all these logs, all this information, and has both threat intelligence applied on top of these feeds, as well as anomalous kind of machine learning type of detection. So they look at your baseline, how much traffic you typically have on a certain EC2 instance. Suddenly there is a port with a huge spike in traffic. That's an anomaly. Or a user is changing a lot bucket policies. That's also an anomaly. Guard Duty will generate findings for you. There are dozens of different findings, and the list is growing. They actually, we talked about the Mitre attack, so these findings actually align with that matrix that was described by Peter in the first talk. So they give you also the possible remediation recommendation. So Guard Duty generates these findings. There are also events. Everything is an event on the AWS cloud. You can trigger, again, whatever procedure you might want, an alert. You can also ingest these to Security Hub, one more service. So Security Hub is our CM kind of like platform that integrates with all these security services I described, like Config, Guard Duty, Inspector, the firewall manager for the WAF rules and the security group rules. Every finding that is generated by any of these services is sent to Security Hub, which then has native integrations to things like Slack for messaging, Jira for opening a ticket, PagerDuty for managing escalations. So that's yet another great service for you to have an overview of your whole, all your accounts in one place, and all the different types of security events. Finally, Guard Duty now also offers malware protection. So this is a kind of a newish feature. And this is different than the vulnerability. The inspector does. The vulnerability looks at, possible vulnerabilities. This is actually looking at actual viruses that you have, actual malicious activity happening. It's only triggered when there are events in Guard Duty findings that are related to malicious, to viruses. For example, command and control. You are maybe, one of your instances is maybe part of a botnet. If there is such a finding in Guard Duty, it will trigger a scan to make sure to check that instance. So it will not impact the instance. It will take a snapshot of the volumes used in the instance and will securely attach it to another instance, run the scan, generate findings if it does find some Trojans or some malware, and again be ingested to Security Hub, so you have one place where you can find all these things. I think that's it. So I don't know, I was on time. Takeaways: create a multi-account landing zone, separate your accounts for different workloads, have a centralized logging account that people cannot tamper with. And for doing that, use Control Tower. Use temporary credentials. So one thing important with single sign-on and the way that service works is that you never get long-lived credentials that are always a security risk. So you always get these temporary tokens, and your identities are in one place, easy to manage, workers who leave company or new workers. Infrastructure as code for consistency, repeatability, but of course security as well. Guard Duty to flag anomalous activity, protect your exposed network services with WAF and Shield, possibly Shield Advanced. Shield is by default, you don't need to enable it. And centralized management of everything, and also visualization, or kind of like being aware of everything that happens with Firewall Manager and Security Hub. Thank you.
Okay, Miguel. What a journey.
Yeah, sorry about that. I know it was a lot.
Services. Do we have questions? We have 5 minutes.
Thank you for the talk. The question from my side is like, how do you envision who should, be the ultimate person to manage all that stuff? So is it like an engineer in the feature team, somebody from SRE team? Should it be like shared responsibility? Like how do you envision it works?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I do realize the talk was a bit more operationally focused, so focusing on operators. And what I've seen in some of the companies I've worked with is they typically have a steering group, they could call it Cloud Center of Excellence, where people from different teams kind of contribute to the platform, but usually there are owners of this platform. It's kind of like a security platform, right? And you could call them DevOps engineers managing this, but with input from teams. So they shouldn't be like isolated. There should be some kind of steering group where people from different teams contribute to this platform. And yeah, that's a good question.
Awesome. More? Peter? No.
Oh, yeah. Looking at, let's say, DDoS attacks and things like that coming towards me, it's easy to kind of like block away small and known malicious operators. And unfortunately, there is also, like you said, that there is a need to detect some guys mining Bitcoin or doing some bad things. So some traffic is also there. So do you also have some kind of automation for external third parties where I could easily report? I know I can probably just send to abuse at AWS or something like that. But is there also kind of some kind of a tooling where I can log in and report and get information back? So was my report correct or so? There are open some solutions, but do you also offer it kind of like as a service?
So actually, when you subscribe to Shield Advanced, okay, again, it's our service, so I don't know about if there is third-party kind of connections that you could use. But Shield Advanced does provide a DDoS dashboard. So you actually get visibility to ongoing DDoS events that have been detected across the AWS network. And you get metrics about your own traffic and your own DDoS. So if there is something that is detected as a possible DDoS event in your own endpoints, you also get separate metrics for those. So there is a kind of, place where you can get these reports of what is happening and inside of the AWS account.
Let's say I'm not an AWS client, I'm wherever, perhaps behind Cloudflare or something like that. Yeah. So could there be also something that I can just report to you easily, the problems you have, some kind of whatever, MISP integrations or things like this?
And it could be even traffic originating from AWS doing a DDoS. Yeah, we do have, like you said, the abuse, like that's the easiest way, I would say. Or if you have AWS team working with you, so I would reach out directly to the account manager or solution architect working with you, and they will be able to find the right people.
Okay, let's have a round of applause for Miguel. And thank you.
Thank you.
For very insightful.